you had this interesting back and forth with Haz al-Din, the streamer, where you challenged him because he thinks that reading Lacan, psychoanalysis, kind of indicates, at least a logical conclusion for him, was that patriarchy is non-overcomable, and you challenge him saying that's not really his point, and that there is non-patriarchal forms of authority.
No, totally. I think Haas, after my debate with him, clearly showed his cards as a sort of right-wing Lacanian. Now, I'm happy to explain what I see as the shortfalls of that. One of the things I was trying to say with Haas al-Din is that, you need to actually read more about Freud and Lacan, precisely because I believe that the mega communist movement that he's putting forward has a very strange and strained relationship to paternal authority. In what sense? Well, what I tried to argue, which I think is still true based on how I've seen their, because I mean, obviously the mega communist thing and Haas's thing is an experimental effort. It's a project, right? And that's actually why I debated Haas, because I realized that it's a project. And so if I could actually take another tactic, was not to just be like cancel fascism, reactionary, etc. But what if I came on the inside and said, well, let's have a philosophical exchange about these concepts? That was my approach. And then, from that, I think now even I can communicate with Haas and give him feedback. Say, look, I think what you're saying and doing is really wrong. And if he listens to me, all the better, as far as I'm concerned. But specifically, Tony, my problem with the structure there is that as a structure of leadership, I found that their whole community is really based on a kind of rigid form of fatherly authority, which avows it. A lot of their followers, when I called Haas as a joke, like as a metaphor even, that he's like a father of the horde, they started to avow it. Like, yeah, he is our father of the horde. And the father of the horde is interesting in psychoanalysis because that's the father who refuses.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I am here with Daniel Tutt, a Marxist intellectual, a working class intellectual, one of my favorites. Daniel Tutt was on this podcast before to discuss his book on Nietzsche, but I think this topic is honestly even more fascinating just because it's a topic that needs a lot more discussion, and that is family abolition and the politics of the family as a whole. Beyond the phrase abolish the family, you tend to get reactions that are pretty instinctual. It's very easy to say in response to abolishing the family that, yeah, these people are insane, these people are out of touch. And from an optic point of view, I would certainly agree from a point of view of practical optics. But here we want to dive more into the actual theory and the actual substance regarding family abolition debate. And Daniel Tutt offers a very rigorous critique and analysis of family abolition discourse, both in terms of proponents of family abolition as well as defenders of the bourgeois family. So, first, before we dive into this book, I would say chronologically, you already kind of lay out the themes very well. What made you want to write this book, and like, who are you responding to? Because it does seem like you're responding to a specific type of thinking on the left.
Yeah, it was one of those books that was sort of I suppose it really emerged when I had kids, which is funny because one of the thinkers that influenced me a lot is this thinker called Christopher Lasch. And I am of the mind that he's sort of a misunderstood left-wing historian with, Marxist commitments, one of the things I've tried to do in the book is clarify some of his theories, some of his concepts about society, about the 20th century, about the left. And one of the things that's interesting about Lasch is he also wrote a book on the family that's not as well known in his wider corpus. It's called Haven in a Heartless World, and it's about the modern family. It's really about the family going from the welfare state, what people often refer to as the golden age of capitalism following the Second World War, to this pernicious shift that occurs with the 1970s, where we experience a kind of liberal triumph, and the family unit is thrown into a new regimen of austerity, is thrown into a new regimen of discipline, a new regimen that had taken away its stability, right? So Lasch wrote his book when he had kids as well, and he was looking out on the discourse on the left and seeing a number of thought figures on the left, which we can talk about them, the 60s moment, right? Which actually far precedes, family abolition far precedes the 60s. We can also address that. Historically, it's important to pinpoint where it emerges in the early 20th century. And so there is a sort of, I don't know if the right word is unheimlich. There's a kind of uncanny feeling that one has when one engages in the social reproductive act of having a family yourself. It's profound. It's a very emotional, almost you could say, Tony, like a reconciliatory event in one's life. And so I was wanting to write the book to clarify how the family is and can be thought of in the tradition of Marxism and in the tradition of liberation, And so, yeah, there's a lot of interlocutors in the text. Deleuze and Guattari are a big focus. Various socialist feminist discourses are a big focus. Another interlocutor is what I call the counterculture left, which is the contemporary left that is championing family abolition. I've actually done several events with them. I have a section in the book that really takes on some of their literature. I'm also looking at the division between populist forms of thinking about the family coming out of the post-left that really do lean on Lasch. And so I'm trying to clarify Lasch's Marxism and push a Marxist interpretation of the culture of narcissism in the book. And then I actually interviewed, by the way, his daughter, Elizabeth Lasch Quinn, who I think agrees with me that he's best read through a Marxist lens, by the way. Not so much this kind of post-left thing, by the way. This is something that Derek Varn and I focus on a lot. You may have seen some of our programs on that. So there's a lot of interlocutors. I have a section on my mentor, Alain Badiou, because a big focus of the text is a theoretical revisitation of what Freud meant by the Oedipus complex. What actually is that? Are we post-Oedipal? Are we pre-Oedipal? Are we just plain old Oedipal? What is that? So I try to clarify the contributions of the French psychoanalyst Jaques Lacan, right, who spent his career redefining the Oedipus complex and trying ultimately in his late years to overcome it. So the big focus of the book is how does one overcome the paternal dependencies? And of course, the fact of overcoming paternal dependencies is interesting because the family is a site where it's not a purely idealist institution in the sense that its authority has a touchstone point in the social. Like the family is already a socialized form of authority. And so therefore is the Oedipal process, right? That's why Lacan has this idea of the names, plural, of the father, which is the idea that one struggles their whole life to overcome the father problem, precisely in the sense that the father problem is displaced onto other figures of fatherly authority from the workplace, right, to one's peers, to all different areas of social life. This Oedipal problem haunts us, right? And so I felt that a lot of folks on the left were not making a sober assessment of where we're at in regards to this question. So a big focus of the book, you could say, is also authority studies, right? How does the left confront authority, and how do we adequately overcome authority, right? So that's a big picture overview. I'm also in dialogue with, like, Mark Fisher's late work in Acid Communism, right? Where he's trying to make a bridge, a solidarity between the counterculture left and a more traditional working class left, right? Which would be for um, authority to some extent, right? And so that's a schism that I felt Fisher dealt with pretty intelligently, right? So I do pull from Mark Fisher's insights there, which I perceive as trying to kind of neutralize the counterculture, I'm sorry, rather the culture war polemics that often get on the inside of the left and split us apart, right? So the question of the book is sort of, how does the left succeed in its aims for overcoming oppressive structures, right? And I think in order to do that, we must first begin with an understanding of things like the Oedipus complex and things like the family, right? What is the structure of the family? Should we overcome the bourgeois family? What does that mean? Should we just sort of do these radical commune experiments? What does that mean, right? What's the best form of the family to promote a kind of healthy individual or subject? These are the questions that the book is trying to tease out.
Yeah, this is a very fascinating whole discussion in general, and I'd like to bring it down a notch a little bit
Yeah.
because there's sort of two wars going on in your book that I see. One is at the theoretical level with sort of more academic debate, but this academic debate between maybe what I'll broadly characterize, although this probably wouldn't be accurate, but between a sort of Lacanian Marxist frame of thinking versus a more anarcho libertarian socialist Deleuzian way of thinking, which would be anti-psychoanalysis. And those types are usually more very pro family abolition. And I'm not saying you're not, because you don't say that you're necessarily not. It's more like we need to actually understand what this means. We should question our preconceptions. And what got me into this topic, what fascinated me most was actually first Wilhelm Reich. And you critique him in your book, his book, The Mass Psychology of Fascism, where he says the family is sort of the first cell of fascist society. It's the first cell of authoritarianism. And he kind of, I guess, in the New Left, popularizes a sort of family abolition politics. Now, what I found kind of hard to wrestle with is the fact that the bourgeois family that he's critiquing also seems to be declining in the time that I'm living in. So while he's saying this, it doesn't seem very almost kind of aged poorly in the sense that the family abolition seems to already be happening through capitalism, in the
Hmm.
sense that this is a big complaint. A lot of people talk about the decline of family or paternal authority as such, and you deal
Hmm.
with these things very well. So I get, and what I found the most interesting aspect was this whole paradox of liberation.
Hmm.
That that while progressive movements of the '60s may have, you know, achieved many great things, it has also come alongside a new spirit of capitalism, which has eroded many of the basic
Yeah.
institutions of human society that have kind of crippled us in a certain way. And you distinguish liberation versus emancipation, which I would like to sort of have as a point that we can gradually touch on. If you'd like to speak first to that, you can, but I was going to kind of start from what the problem with the bourgeois family is. I think that is something that maybe more lay listeners or even just listeners who hear leftist discourse, they hear that, they might have not actually thought like, "Okay, well, why is the bourgeois family
Yeah.
bad?" And what even is it? Because you do a good job of
Yeah.
historicizing it and as a pretty new phenomenon.
Okay, great. So the bourgeois family, in a certain sense, has to be understood as emanating from a 19th century European origin, founded off of the coattails of the universalism implicit in the French Revolution. And also, it has to be understood as the kind of the groundwork of the production of the self. And the self, therefore, is thought of as a kind of whole project, right? A kind of project that is in struggle, that is in becoming, that is trying to realize something. The politics of selfhood. Christopher Lasch would always write about this. And one of the things he said in his book, The Minimal Self, is that after the 1970s, the project of becoming a self, that's why it's called minimal self, is itself at stake, is declining. And the bourgeois family, therefore, provides the kind of definition of what it means to be a cultivated self. And therefore, what that actually means is that the family becomes a haven whereby exemption from labor is possible, whereby value formation of one's own self-worth is made realizable in the family. And that's important because we know that in capitalist society, according to Marx, the logic is exchange value. It's not use value. So if you become a worker, you risk becoming commodified. Therefore, you risk your value in the world becoming an instrumentalized form of value. Well, where is the first experience that the subject has where that form of value is contested? And the truth is that it's in the family. Now, of course, one of the other things there is the notion of gift exchange. This is very important because we live in capitalism, right? Which functions on the logic of commodity exchange. But the family introduces a different form of exchange, right? A different form of symbolic exchange, in which the bourgeois family in particular introduces its children, its subjects, to a form of gift exchange that is tied into their merit, into their value, into their project of selfhood, that subjects that are not in bourgeois families don't have access to, right? So immediately what we find and what we must acknowledge, so the bourgeois family is therefore a kind of the universal family available in capitalism. And therefore, if you are of a different class position, a different class experience, of a different class background, you are striving to imbue some of its promises in a partial way, right? In a limited way. And so therefore it creates a dialectic. It creates therefore a struggle. And one of the things that, Marx and Engels wrote about is this precise class-based struggle within the family. And that is why when the Communist Manifesto talks about abolition of the family, they are speaking of it in this class exclusive formation. It's also why a Bolshevik thinker like Kollontai will talk about extending some of the implicit universalism of this project of selfhood to the working class family, right? If you read Goran Thurborn's wonderful, he's a Marxist sociologist. He wrote a book on a huge study of the family across the 20th century. And I really found this book important because one of the things he showed in that book is that after Russia and China went communist, the companionate marriage structure of the old bourgeois family from the 19th century still remained the structure in these communist revolutions. Wilhelm Reich, who you mentioned a moment ago, had the idea that in Bolshevik revolution, the Oedipus complex itself, as a psychical structure based in the bourgeois family, would wither away. If you read his lectures that he gave in the USSR, you can see that. And of course, that was then, you have to understand that Wilhelm Reich, the so-called Doctor of Love, right, became the preeminent thinker, one of the preeminent thinkers of the 60s sexual revolution, right? And that same concept of a total overthrow of the Freudian notion of the Oedipus complex, and which of course itself is inextricable from the bourgeois family itself. We can talk about that in a moment. That was the presupposition. Now, I think, Tony, the big challenge has been that presupposition of Reich has not been borne out by history. That is not actually what occurred in Russia, in China. That is not so you can, in other words, you can have a revolution in the mode of production. And that doesn't necessarily abolish the family in the way that a lot of libertine leftists, if you want to use that phrase, thought that it would, right? And that goes back to this kind of sober historical analysis that I think we should bring to bear on this issue. So we can talk about a genealogy of the bourgeois family. It does change. And one of the important points at which its changing composition occurs is the rise of what is usually called, after the Second World War, the managerial state, right? Or the bureaucratization of everyday life in capitalist society, in which you have a new form of paternalism take place in the labor sphere, right? And what this actually implies, and this is a big focus of a lot of thinkers, and I would here recommend folks read Jacques Danzelot, who wrote a book called The Policing of Families, where he actually shows that bureaucrats post World War II, social workers, professors, social scientists, etc., re-engineered the family. And in so doing, what they did was they usurped the stability of the family's authority structures, the old bourgeois family authority structures, in ways which actually led to a quite pernicious outcome for the larger project of selfhood and self-development. This is a theme that Lasch also touches on. And this then creates a big debate with a lot of socialist feminists, because at stake in the debate is, how are we theorizing a healthy family relation in which subjects produce a liberated, or if you like, autonomous subjectivity, right? That's kind of what we're ultimately interested in, right? Which is like, what version of the family, right, could produce a liberated subject? What is the meaning of liberation, right? Like, so it's a sort of philosophical question, in fact, is at the heart of this, of my book, but also at this, of this question. And Danzelot and Lasch are critiqued, right, in ways which are quite interesting, right? So there's a whole sort of very important debate going on with sociologists, with feminist philosophers in this question, in this kind of quagmire. And if you read, for example, a book on the counterculture by Philip Rieff, I don't know how familiar you are with Rieff, he takes on Wilhelm Reich directly. And he says that the biggest impediment of Reich is this precise notion that he's presenting a theory of liberation, which is trying to psychically remove a structure, right? A structure of paternal authority that has to be transcended. It's almost as if, like, you're removing the necessary impediments that allow for psychic liberation to occur. This is an insight that the Slovene school, Mladen Dolar, Alenka Zupančič, and Slavoj Žižek, are also very big on, which is that the Oedipus complex has to be thought of not as something which we must completely usurp or transcend or abolish in some kind of strong way, but we rather have to work through it. And that there therefore needs to be thought, what are the preconditions for creating a family structure in which subjects can accept authority in order to more adequately transcend it? Because one of the paradoxes of liberation, to use this concept that I develop in the book, is precisely that, which is, you can have an antinomian revolt. And Freud was very much concerned about this around 1920, around after the war, after the First World War, in which you basically reproduce a superegoic structure in the act of your revolt. And this is something that Kojin Karatani, the Japanese philosopher, also writes quite a lot about, right? So this question is a sort of dialectical question, a question of how does one overcome a social structure while also recognizing that in the act of abolishing, in the act of revolting, one also becomes an authority, or must decide on the dispensation of authority. It creates a certain crisis of authority. And Freud knew that. And you may remember in my third chapter on this notion of the invention of the superego, there's a super interesting story basically about Freud's concept of superego, which everybody talks about. One of the things I show in the book, Tony, and you may remember this, is that Freud's concept of superego was literally in dialogue with the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. In other words, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 created a crisis for the burgeoning science of psychoanalysis, because Freud was forced to confront how a logic of social authority mediates the unconscious. Because if the Soviet structure were to succeed across Europe, right, of this kind of working class agitation that completely obliterates the bourgeois norms, the bourgeois structure in society, a lot of liberal jurists, a lot of liberal intellectuals were pushing Freud to come up with an answer for how psychoanalysis basically is to stabilize the social order, right? In other words, how do you preserve something from the old bourgeois social authority in the act of a revolution, in the mutation of a revolution? And basically, Freud has a kind of conservative answer to this. Freud is not anti revolutionary, very fascinated with revolution. He's trying to develop a concept that would mediate a stabilizing concept, superego, in the act of a revolutionary sequence, which I think is very difficult for us to theorize in our world today because we live in capitalist realism, right? Like we don't. I was realizing this recently. Like I love to read 20th century Marxists, right? Because they literally were confronting a world where capitalism was revolutionizing, right? To even conceptualize that for us is sort of like an imagination that we lack. You know what I mean? It's like a kind of so it's very important, I think, though, to read about those moments in history. So, anyways, I've given you quite a lot, but perhaps you can jump in as you wish.
Bring it down to earth a little bit for people who are sort of new to this discourse, me being that the case for family abolition on behalf of its advocates, the people you're kind of
Sure.
in dialogue with, because they make a certain case. And to be honest, it is kind of ambiguous when it comes to like family abolitionists, because the more obvious critique of the bourgeois family would be, inheritance laws, property, just institutionalized patriarchy, that kind of favors male domination. But some would say that has, been drastically declined or even reversed in today's society. That's what critics would say. But what I remember reading is something, a common case that I heard is that under neoliberalism, which paradoxically, you discuss how it actually had a big role in the decline of the family and the decline of paternal authority. Scholars like Wendy Brown, for example, in her book on neoliberalism, will make the point that neoliberal ideologists and technocrats wanted to bolster up the bourgeois family as sort of a replacement for the welfare state, as a way to kind of allow people to cope for the fact that the welfare state was being cut. And that's why in a neoliberal era, you see people like Reagan and Thatcher talking a lot about the family. So I can see the family
Yeah.
abolitionists are reacting to that, but what are they advocating for generally, and what is the case
Hmm.
they're making? Because you can hear, you can think anything from inheritance laws all the way to the abolition of custody and custody over children, and this idea of a more communal way of taking care of kids, which I think scares most people the most when it comes to this discourse, and probably the part
Yeah.
about the abolition that I'm the most skeptical of. So yeah, I would like you to kind of present that perspective and your response to it.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you look at like the new manifesto of family abolition by Sophie Lewis, the basic argument is socialization of care, abolition of family revolving around a theory of the family for her that is a sort of white, cis, heteronormative. She puts a huge emphasis on how the bourgeois family is not to be understood in her analysis. She never uses the word class. There's no distinction of value for them. There is, we can talk about it for in my analysis if you wish, but there's no sense in which there is a kind of proletarian or proletarianization of the family. Like you said a moment ago, that neoliberalism has receded the family or the family has waned, it has not been triumphant. There is a sense when you read family abolitionism that there is some kind of triumph of the family. And that is the idea of Thatcher that neoliberalism is based on the mantra, right? That society does not exist. There are only individuals and families, right? And so this notion that the family is a site for the production of a kind of oppressive exchange value, right? A pure instrumentalization of individuals is their idea. So for them, they recognize that people have attachments to paternal authorities. They recognize that the family is attractive. But what they, I think, want to do is concoct an ideological alternative to convince particularly young people, because a big focus of their literature is about the liberation of youth, which itself has a fascinating prehistory, even stretching back to the philosophy of William James, the great pragmatist philosopher. For example, in his book on the varieties of religious experience, he argued that um, adolescence, right, possesses a certain intuitive, almost mystical source of knowledge, right? And a lot of libertine, bohemian, petty bourgeois intellectuals would be very influenced by this idea. And so we've seen a tradition emerge really since pre-World War One on the American left, all the way to the present, for a counterculture leftism to really think that the promotion of adolescence is the site for something liberatory. We see this also in a lot of like standard liberal ideas, that the kind of the youth will save us, right? This idea is very prominent across the left. And myself, I'm not opposed to this idea that youth have something to teach us, but I am sort of opposed to this idea that there is a rivalrous structure that is almost interminable, or that therefore we must abandon the structure of the family entirely, right? And that's, I think, what often we get. Now, one of the things I don't do, Tony, is I don't bring out this critique of family abolitionists, which you often see on the post left, whereby they say, well, family abolitionists are sort of narcissists because they're just not acknowledging that they are projecting their own problems with their own family and they're making it universal. That's the sort of bad faith critique,
Right,
right?
that they just have daddy issues.
Yeah, they just, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't accept
Could
that
be
bad.
true, but that's not a good argument that's not a really a good argument against, like, in the sense that, like, you might be a Marxist because you don't have money, and if you got money, you wouldn't be a Marxist. That's not a good argument against Marxism.
Yeah, exactly. It's too subjectivist and it's not taking their argument, but I mean, they produce a sort of genealogy, right? So their genealogy is not so much Marxist. They start with Charles Fourier and the utopian socialist development of this kind of alternative community in which you could have basically a sort of fundamentally communal and open form of care on a commune structure that would be based on these kind of micro communities, right? So I think in strategic terms, that actually is what they want. They want like community kitchens, they want sort of networks of care. They envision, they're very insurrectionary, right? So anarchism and communism for them is not a contradiction in strategy. They're sort of united, right? And what I find interesting is that a lot of the influences that determine their thought come out of radical critiques of the welfare state in the United States. And, one of the things that happen in what we call third way politics, which theoretically was very much influenced by John Rawls in his notion of the asset based welfare system from a theoretical level, but practically it was Bill Clinton and Tony Blair that were reforming welfare, right? And they were reforming welfare in ways that Melinda Cooper will basically suggest reverts capitalism back to what she calls the Elizabethan poor laws, right? Which is very close to the neo-feudal thesis, right? Which is that the poor, the working class in neoliberalism are basically subordinated to a kind of brutal disciplinary market situation in which the old welfare affordances are basically gone away with, right? And so there's a certain set of demands which are paradoxical for the family abolitionists because they don't rely on a theory of the state. They don't have the idea that we should be for like electoralism or for sort of traditional ways of gaining the rights of the marginalized vis-a-vis politics in a representational way, in a normal way. They're opposed to that. But yet still they want to think of demands at the site of this kind of insurrectionary commune that would upset the, authority of reigning politics. So I find a lot of that difficult to conceptualize, like how that will actually function, especially in the wake of like Occupy Wall Street, which because Occupy Wall Street had a lot of that same anarcho, this notion that Simon Critchley had of like, impossible demands are the horizon of the left, right? And I felt that sort of the impossible demand never had a receiver. That's actually one of the funny things about authority and neoliberalism is that like the emperor is absent in some sense, right? So the idea of the impossible demand itself can be like a feedback loop that goes nowhere in certain way if you don't have a rigorous theory of how you're going to contest state power, build organization, etc. So they're less interested in that, right? They're interested in what I see as a kind of spontaneous commune structure. And then from that, the heteronormative, cisgendered, white, patriarchal family will wither, right? And if everybody laughs at them, that is something that can be resolved by finding intellectual comrades and allies on the left. And I think it's at that point where they try to form a sort of marketing strategy, right, for family abolition, right, whereby they can try to unite different theoretical tendencies on the left to support the idea of family abolition and then try to convince people of it. So it becomes a bit like that, a bit of a kind of marketing strategy. And again, so that answers your question. I could say more, but I think that hopefully answers your question of how I understand their project.
Right. And I think it would be almost all too easy to critique it merely as a marketing strategy because as a marketing strategy, I think it's absolutely horrendous. I think one of the worst things to kind of inflate to get into leftist discourse. But I think what we're more interested in, I guess, is the substance which you were getting into. And one point that seemed like a huge theme throughout your whole book, and kind of what you just been saying, is that the problem with this sort of new left discourse with the regards to the family and the state is that it's paradoxically all too compatible with capitalism, or with at least the new spirit of capitalism. That we could debate when that emerges, but you kind of just talked about the third way. And the
Mm,
third way, I believe, is when the progressives became the dominant wing of capital, the preferred wing of capital. Now,
mhm,
that's a very controversial thing to kind of say. And it will not so much controversial to say, but it's a difficult thing because a lot of people take many different conclusions when they see this, because it's a kind of thing that when you see it, it's hard to unsee. And I think a lot of people, if they don't take the problems that the new left posed and look further into the leftist tradition, they easily slip into kind of post left thinking. Because when they see that, oh, the progressives are actually kind of doing capitalism's job, it's very easy to be like, I am post left, right? And I think if we the only way to really, like, deal with this is to go through the contradiction as opposed to kind of reacting one way to it. But, I mean, is that sort of a big point of yours, that kind of family abolition, or at least the case for it, and the anti-statist sort of thinking in many ways is compatible with capitalism? I saw that most presciently in the chapter called "Accelerate the Superego," which was, your critique of Deleuze and Guattari. I've
mhm.
seen this critique made before, like Jaques made it before, but you made it more from, like, I think it was honestly more in depth.
I try to be more practical because I feel like, again, going back to that point I made about the late Mark Fisher, after he was so vehemently attacked for critiquing the left, right? Because I think one of the things you got to realize is, in a certain way, if we have an ideology um, that privileges the intuitive power of youth as the agent of autonomous liberation, if we have an ideology which perceives of the left in a spontaneous sense, almost like a kind of quasi-religious sense, right? The left as like the ones that suffer the most in society, and we abandon a class framework of thinking about organizing the left. One of the things I would want to say to family abolitionists is that, there is a tradition of family abolition from a Marxist point of view that we must contend with, right? Because I don't want to create again, a bad faith exchange in which we're basically saying, yeah, this entire discourse of like Verso books and the sort of PMC thesis must be obliterated or destroyed or made humiliated, because that itself, speaking of Oedipus, would only intensify a false sight of rivalry. Because you see, for me, capitalism and the new spirit of capitalism. What is the new spirit of capitalism? The new spirit of capitalism, according to, say, Jean Baudrillard, in his very interesting work After May 68, the French philosopher, it is defined by the idea that no longer are the antagonisms of the system solely located within the productive sphere, but the antagonisms of the capitalist system have become encrusted into the infrastructure and what Engels calls the superstructure, right? The culture. And in that sense, it's the kind of culturalization of capitalist conflict, antagonism, and so on that we on the left must confront. And that is why, the new spirit of capitalism is the absorption of revolts against capitalism, somehow paradoxically making the system stronger, right? The famous idea in that regard is the notion that a new generation can basically promote a highly revolutionary rhetorical platform. They can get into the streets, they can protest, they can seemingly have the most strident total critique of the system, but the system at the same time does not modify its means of production, its mode of production. The class composition remains static. So there's this kind of strange rhetorical cultural impotence, right, in the new spirit of capitalism that I think this is where we get the question also of French theory, right, and its complicity in this new spirit of capitalism. But you have to understand one, I think, material fact that is often overlooked, which is a generational fact, which is that monopoly capitalism, right, this kind of mutation in what a lot of theorists, including Baudrillard, called neo-capitalism, in which capitalism no longer has competition. You have the monopolization of markets. You have the rise of finance capitalism. You have all of these changes that challenge the core Marxist productivist idea that struggles and contestations of capitalism primarily need to take place within the productive sphere, right? One of the things that is interesting about that is the idea that French thought was actually subordinated to a form of neo-colonialism itself under what is called the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan was a sort of ingenious strategy that allowed for the improvement in the quality of life of huge sections of the French working class from about the late 1940s all through the 1970s. And it's a kind of modernization strategy. But as a modernization strategy that came and used forms of American cultural imperialism to pacify the revolt of the French students and of the French petty bourgeois. And so this is where you get this idea of neo-capitalism, right? Out of this strange paternalism. And this paternalism also, by the way, was also present for the baby boomers in the United States, right? After the Second World War, one of the reasons that the civil rights movement started, at least on elite campuses. I don't know if you're familiar with this, Tony, but it's called in loco parentis. Are you familiar with this law, in loco parentis? Does it ring a bell? The very interesting idea. It's basically this idea in the place of parents, right? And they have them at universities today, right? And it's this idea that college students, the administrators, the bureaucrats at colleges must implement forms of repressive authority onto students in the place of parents, in loco parentis. And one of the early revolts that started the sequence of what would become the free speech movement, civil rights, and so on the campus of Berkeley in the 1950s was a revolt against the paternal authority. And they won. They abolished in local parentheses laws. Now, one of the interesting things, if you read Melinda Cooper's book, fast forward to the neoliberal period, what we're now finding, and this shows a shift, I think, in the authority structure, by the way, at a macro level, social level, is that in local parentheses laws have become more entrenched. There's more paternalism imposed on undergraduates, young people in colleges. And in fact, it is actually leading to a punitive, it's actually structurally sort of the origin of what we might call a kind of cancel culture punitive turn. Because a lot of students are actually saying, we want more in local parentheses laws. I want more individual protection for my rights as a student. I want the bureaucracy to protect me more, not less. So it's a very interesting pivot of a mode of revolt in which the 68 generation actually had this highly libertine anti-paternalism. Whereas one of the quagmires of the contemporaries, we don't know how to be anti-paternalist because in reality, the state has abandoned its old welfare structure. So we have zero stability. If anything, what we want is the stable job. We want the long contract, right? We have these demands. Are they to the state? No, actually, more so they're to the state qua market as a unique configuration, right? So you see my point. We now have what I call a kind of ultra paternalization, right? This idea of social paternalism is something I get from Lasch, okay? So that example of in loco parentis from boomers to now shows something actually maybe noble about how their form of revolt succeeded, right? Because I do think actually like paternalism, social paternalism needs to be fought, needs to be combated. But because we have a material situation that is so precarious today, it's like we've lost the ability to do that.
Right. And I think one way to put it is that if you advocate the abolition of certain forms of authority, such as paternal authority, and you're in a material circumstance that still necessitates some kind of protection, you end up just outsourcing that paternal authority outside of the family elsewhere. So you don't really get the
Yeah.
abolition of like oppression or authority. You just get a multitude of authorities instead of, you know, one of the things you were alluding to with the new spirit of capitalism and neo-capitalism. I read that very short book Michel Clouscard has called Neo-Capitalism.
Mhm.
And although I kind of disagree with the way he characterizes the Frankfurt School in this, I think his broader point was very sound in that the new left advocacy of opening up these new forms of desire and kind of shackling, breaking down all the shackles of authority and things that inhibit us from autonomous expression and the flourishment of our desires in a material context that is capitalism, which has a imperative to accumulation. It's almost perfectly compatible with it. Or I wouldn't say perfectly, but it's compatible with it in the sense that capitalism post 70s at least became a consumer capitalism, not a producer capitalism. So this sort of
Exactly.
liberal progressive
Yeah.
ideology, it fits a kind of new consumer capitalism, which is, I'm my own person. I'm an
Mhm.
individual free agent. I want to be able to consume as much as I want and not feel bad, but I also need to be my best self. I also need to work hard, but I also need to enjoy. So it's like, it reminds me a lot about what Zizek says about the superego. And I know you have a bit of disagreements with the way he uses superego, but he kind of talks about the new superego is not one of guilt. It's not one of guilt for enjoying. It's one of guilt of not enjoying. We want
Mhm.
to enjoy more. So I thought that was really interesting. Could perhaps we say that in many ways, like culture of politics that tries to advance beyond material circumstances kind of does well, I wouldn't say does capitalism's job, but it accompanies capitalism's already accelerating tendency because
Yeah. Well, I mean,
use the word
a lot of
acceleration
the
of superego, and it made me think of accelerationism.
Mhm.
And there are people on the radical left who unironically advocate, for example, gender accelerationism. And sometimes they have a point. And sometimes, but also it makes me think of like the new transhumanist culture in capitalism now, which is
Mhm.
kind of optimizing the human body, the rise of plastic surgery, and you know all that.
Yeah, in the neo-capitalist literature, in French theory, but really beyond French theory as well, what we do find is the politicization of the subject thought within the sphere of production. I'm sorry, within the sphere of consumption, no longer within the sphere of production. And one of the kind of historical arguments I try to make is that the mutations in consumptive capitalism or neo-capitalism after the 2008 economic crash, because one of the mantras of Baudrillard is that no longer should the left concern itself with exploitation, right? Because to overcome these new forms of kind of control that consumer neo-capitalism is imposing on us, yeah, it does call for exceeding its own purview of what's able to be offered to it in terms of demand. So you get a kind of ludic counterculture. You can see why the politicization of culture becomes all that's available, because the antagonisms now reside within consumption, they reside within the superstructure, they reside within culture. But basically, I think after 2008, like we've made a big return back to production. And I think actually exploitation is back on the table. And that's actually from a theoretical standpoint interesting, because a lot of the French theory, a lot of the sort of Marxist ideas had it that the old proletariat, right, the old working class productive based proletariat, their nostalgia for stability, right, should be combated, should be questioned. Because why? Because actually it could produce a subjectivity which is reactionary, right? Which somehow wants the status quo to persist in some way, when the task should be to accelerate these contradictions in consumption in the cultural sphere. And I
True.
think, in hindsight, one of the problems with that is that it has divided the left. I mean, we saw the results in the recent French election of the working class. I don't have the numbers on me right now, but they were startling in terms of how the left has continuously lost the working class. And part of it, I think, from a theoretical standpoint, kind of goes back to this, right? Because if we say, for example, that, and we know this sociologically and ethnographically, that the desire for working class people for like a stable family, or the desire to reproduce the family, is reactionary, like that itself is such a non starter, right? But I do think, in fact, that a lot of family abolitionists kind of do say that.
Well,
Ultimately, they are kind of saying that, right? And I just feel like that's not based in the reality principle of everyday life. Because you have to understand, one of the things that this accelerationist French theory thing was also trying to do was make an argument. To some extent, you see this in Marcuse, that the reality principle of contemporary capitalism is a patriarchal reality principle that itself must be overcome, right? And I always felt that was uncharitable to a large section of the population who, because here you get into elitist territory.
you definitely get that with Eros and Civilization. I mean, that's where he's most famous for that. But there's an interesting turn in his thought. I don't want to bring it to Marcuse, but
Sure, sure.
Marcuse
I know
kind of
you know.
moves away almost from that sort of thinking and weirdly becomes increasingly aware that capitalism's having sort of opposite trajectory, and that many of the new left ideas are kind of becoming compatible with the system. Like he sort of sees that in Counter Revolution and Revolt, but that's another discussion.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. But you see the point, which is one of a kind of humility in reality, right? And this is why Jennifer Silva's book is so important to me. Jennifer Silva wrote a book called Coming Up Short: Life in the Millennial Working Class Family, something like that. I may have butchered that title, but I just want to recommend everybody look at this book. Often we talk about classes as if they're sort of one category. And Silva reminds us that the experiences, I'm sorry, often we talk about generations as if they're one category. Silva reminds us that the millennial generation, just like all generations, are actually split by class experience. And as it pertains to the family, one of the things that working class millennials, how they differ from their middle class counterparts, right, is that they do have a more passionate attachment to the family. You have to ask yourself why, right? I suppose part of the reason why that is it's self psychoanalytic, right? In the sense that that which you are deprived of, your desire will be drawn more to it, in some sense. And I think there's that, but there's also the lived fact that working class people deal with a lot more family precarity, and therefore they have to, at a young age, often take it upon themselves to restore and keep together a family, right? Which is a level of responsibility that can be quite profound if you know it firsthand, in terms of, say, you have a divorced family, say you have an alcoholic in your family, and at a young age, you have to stand in and be a father for your siblings, for example, just as an example, which I think is a common experience. And then you then advocate for those types of subjects, right? Some type of notion of family abolition. It doesn't quite make sense, precisely because, first of all, in a lived reality, that family has already fragmented, hasn't been abolished, right? But its fragmentation has produced a lot of psychic struggles for you and for your kin and for your friends, for your life. And so this idea of accelerating that becomes difficult, I think, to conceptualize in a certain way. And I think also that what I wanted to see, and what I actually find in my historical studies of socialists in the age of revolution, right? Where capitalism could be overthrown, where, a new class could take power and things of that nature, was really more a model of this, like, sublation into a form of thinking the companionate marriage structure, a form of thinking the family that would actually maximize certain underlying universal principles in the old bourgeois family form, retain them, but make them better, right? And then, of course, empirically, Silva shows that young people today really still want the family by huge numbers. And so, like, as a leftist project, if we're trying to sort of brand the left, right, I think that matters. And I think that we do have to get in the art of actually saying, like, these ideas need to resonate with people. Like, there is an implicit desire for revolution. I insist. But that involves a sort of coordination, right? That involves education, right? That involves like what did Marx say? Marx said something very interesting once, which is the task of communists is to show that the current revolts against capitalism are are themselves bound up with the communist direction. They just don't know it. See my point? So that question of keeping open, right? Not forcing, right? That the antagonisms, the struggles of our present adhere to latently a resistance to capitalism for which those agents may not know that. They may not see that. They should be shown that.
Right.
That makes sense to you?
Yes. I had an original question. Now I'm trying to see how to phrase it. But you mentioned before that preserving the bourgeois family or just the family, right? In the defense of people who would say they defend the family. They don't say the bourgeois family. They say we want to defend family. And I had a good experience with my family. I was in a two-parent household, luckily no divorce. So like I never really was sympathetic to critiques of the family until I encountered actually more people from the Middle East. So I'm half Lebanese, but most of my family moved outside of Lebanon after the Civil War, so they didn't have as strict structures as many people who I encountered who came straight from Middle Eastern countries like, for example, the UAE and Jordan. And then when I saw how insanely patriarchal, a lot of the conditions women have to live through, I totally sympathize with it. I was like, I see it. But in our context, I see more people who are saying, well, I wish my parents had more time to spend time with me, or I wish, we actually had time to have kids. No one has the money to have kids anymore. And so there's something about it, family abolition discourse, it's deeply alienating to people that kind of, at least it's not very appealing. And you mentioned that the right has had an easier time to respond to this than the left, precisely because we haven't really reconciled with these contradictions very well. And when you mentioned about defense of the bourgeois family being reactionary, is a question I want to ask, because when I read your book, and actually when I read that book and when I read your more recent Nietzsche book, I see echoes of almost a Marxist version of Alan Bloom. It's very different, but what I want to say is Alan Bloom's book, famous book, The Closing of the American Mind, has a lot of similar critiques of the left, except that he takes a reactionary position.
Yeah.
He kind of thinks that the old ways, he doesn't critique the old ways. Let's just say that, but he points out that the new left is Nietzschean, not Marxist, and I thought that was
Well,
really
I
interesting.
know. Yeah, I
Yeah, and
know.
you mentioned that in the book. Well, you mentioned Bloom briefly, I think once, but what I thought is interesting about that is that he's trying to say the new left is the dominant ideology. This, I guess, it speaks to the paradox of liberation, which we can get into. Is to a certain extent the liberation succeeded, but the emancipation didn't. And what I wanted to say about the defense of of a family being reactionary, well, I'll ask you a more philosophical question: is why is it self-evident that is bad?
Well, it's a good question, and this is a dialectic because if you look back, let me first start really with the 19th century, and then I'll talk about the present. If you look back at Marx and Engels, they waffle, frankly. I'm talking about Marx and Engels as political actors in the struggle for communism, right? Throughout their lives, right? What do they waffle around? They waffle precisely around the universalism implicit in the French Revolution, and therefore in the ideals, right? The notion of ideals of bourgeois society, right? It depends upon the status of the class struggle. At times, Marx will advocate for a type of solidarity with fulfilling, with completing some of those ideals. Whereas at other times, communism is to be thought of as in an antagonistic relationship to those ideals, right? That those ideals have become like rhetorically and practically completely absorbed by the ruling class, right? And I think it is that class struggle basis by which we can understand the notion of the ideals of the middle class family. If we want to call the middle class family synonymous with the bourgeois family, I think we should. We have to understand that I think it's dispensation, right? Its promises, right? Are now governed in a disciplinary and punitive way, right? It's governed through discipline on debt. It's governed through austerity in the workplace. It's governed through the decline of real wages. It's governed through the anxiety and annoyance and day-to-day struggle that people have, which itself is the font of racism, in my view, primarily, over trying to make it. I mean, the myth of the happy family was invented in the 1950s. It's a very new myth. But that struggle to keep up with the Joneses, etc., no politician talks about fulfilling the universal promises of the American dream, of the middle class dream. It's only been recently that the liberal parties in America even utter the word working class, right? Because you see the third way moment of Rawls, Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, etc. I only include Rawls to annoy our friend Matt McManus because he thinks that Rawls is a great thinker for socialism, whereas I think that he's the philosopher of the third way. But the third way
Mhm.
was basically unable to think how we now live in this new, what I call punitive capitalist system. And it's producing interesting effects. I mean, it's producing effects where people are working class people, according to Silva's study, which I mentioned a moment ago, are rejecting the middle class family. And they're creating different ideals. And those ideals, by the way, Tony, are falling in line with what is called the therapeutic. And the therapeutic is a very important concept invented by Philip Rieff and then by Lasch as well, which refers to this idea starting about in the 1930s or so of the new bureaucracy that I mentioned that emerges across corporate America and beyond, in which therapy becomes almost like a disciplinary force over citizens. Disciplinary in the sense that it foments a type of atomized individualism and provides a relief of the antagonisms of exploitation, right? But individually so, right? Well, what we're finding now, and I've written about this as a critique actually of Lasch and Reef in some sense, is that working class people today are in some ways rejecting the middle class family and basically saying, well, my ideal would be to improve myself. My ideal would be to become sober, to overcome an addiction, to, I don't know, have pets. So there's kind of this like lessening, right? This kind of like even the movement for like tiny houses is a part of this. This sort of idea of accepting. It's like uber capitalist realist. Right? Like almost like the close
Yeah.
of a collective vision of the transformation of society, right? And I get it. I get it. But it's the imposition of an oppressive form of reality, right? A kind of narrow individualism in which the middle class ideals are gone. So you see the point. We're in a place now where, yeah, you can say that hearkening back to them is reactionary, but it's not going to get you very far outside of maybe like Twitter and social media and like universities, elite universities, because that's not the lived experience that people are having in this situation. You know what I'm saying? It's so different than that. And people are having to adapt. People are having to adapt to the age of diminishing expectations, which is the subtitle of Lasch's famous book on the culture of narcissism. It's a beautiful subtitle. I think it's exactly right, which is narcissism is driven by a forced adherence to a survivalist culture, right? That's narcissism. Narcissism, therefore, is the symptomatic aggressive responses to that imposition on people, right? That's a different way of thinking about narcissism, I think, than the colloquial way of thinking about it as like, oh, just me first. You know what I'm saying? I find it much better to think about it in this way.
It's like a cope, in a way to cope with one's impotence in the world is a way to kind of bolster up one's individuality to be like, yes, I am autonomous. Yes, I am capable. It's not like actually Elijah Emery, this kid who's very well read in Lash, came on my pod to discuss this, and he described it very well. That the old logic was sort of uh, be part like obey the system. And the new logic is I am the system,
Yeah.
which is kind of like the individuals, internalizing their own importance in this structure. And I guess to relate that to French theory and family abolition, when I first attempted at reading A Thousand Plateaus by Deleuze and Guattari, to be honest, I really probably only understood about 2 chapters of that, one of them being the rhizome chapter. And when I came away from it, I thought this is all very fascinating, and it does apply. It's appealing to me because love philosophy and I love exploring different things, and I'm kind of an artistic mind. But I think really that what does this amount to politically? It feels like almost a pamphlet self-help book for late capitalism, like how to survive. Like it's not I'm not to diminish its sophistication. It's very sophisticated as a book, and they're very sophisticated theorists, and they are self-described communists, but it did seem to me like this is kind of a way to survive in the gig economy. Like what be a nomadic subject, not to be a rhizomatic subject with that is not attached to one thing, not having one identity, rather very adaptable. It's like the new subject of capitalism, which is, you know, fashionism instead of fascism, as Sheldon Wolin put it.
No, it's true. There's something implicit about it that is de-solidarity driven, or this sort of gives us a new theory of, one of Freud's best contributions is his theory of groups. And I find that Deleuze and Guattari have their own theory of groups, which itself presents us a very serious rebuke to the kind of core Marxist wager about what Marx would call the necessity of the independent organization of the working class. With Deleuze and Guattari, we get a sense of groups that is what they call the groupsicle, and its structure, right, is based on the logic in which um, contradictions of the productive system of capitalism are not what actually affect us at a subjective level, right? So they have a whole new post dialectical conception of social conflict on the one hand. And on the other hand, they have kind of like a strategy for how revolutionary groups can form and, I would say, contest the system, but in a certain sense, they want to um, ride the wave of the capitalist system to, I don't know, produce some kind of short circuit or to produce some type of acceleration beyond it. But there's, as I try to articulate in my chapter, a lot of blind spots and a lot of sites where that formula, that strategy is easily able to become co-opted by the system. And of course, I show that actually Deleuze himself makes a kind of about face. He makes a pivot away from that old strategy of anti-Oedipus, which itself was an experimental praxis, right? So he abandons the anti-Oedipus praxis, which I think, if true, and I do believe it to be true, therefore we should read anti-Oedipus as an almost historical fragment locked in a particular moment, right? That may not offer the praxeological insights or the what is to be done insights that are needed today. And that's fine. Like, it can therefore be kind of read as almost like a warning message, right? And for online Deleuzians, they get quite upset at that prospect because I think they still want to insist there is something subversive in it. And
Mhm.
so that's a debate that is healthy and one that we need to have. And I try to do that, so long as they're not attacking me and trying to obliterate me or destroy me. I try to have that debate. But there's a lot in Deleuze and Guattari that needs to be thought through because it's a very theoretically rich text. And also in Thousand Plateaus, they also walk back a lot of, and Ray Brassier is good on pointing these things out. They walk back a lot of the extremism in the first volume of Anti-Oedipus, by the way. So they try to kind of moderate their position. And I would actually say they are constantly moderating until it becomes almost like done. And it's done in the early 90s, in my view.
Well, that would make sense because the postscript on societies of control, I think, is one of
Yeah.
Deleuze's best pieces of writing in terms of aging well, in terms of describing our moment, of
Yes.
impersonal domination, of rather a sort of system with no head, a kind of like form of impersonal domination by systems of bureaucracy and as well as lack of stability. He kind of like n- points out a lot of germinations of trends that would become the society that we live in. But I
Yes.
can see why, especially people on the anarchist end like Anti-Oedipus, because I mean, it's probably the most sophisticated rejection of psychoanalysis made from the left, at least from a theoretical point of view. And I can see why they don't like psychoanalysis because if taken to its logical conclusion, you can't really not have any authority. I mean, this is my view, and you had this interesting back and forth with Haz al-Din, the streamer, where you challenged him because he thinks that reading Lacan psychoanalysis kind of indicates, at least a logical conclusion for him, was that patriarchy is non-overcomable, and you challenge him saying that's not really his point, and that there is non-patriarchal forms of authority. To which I would
Mhm.
agree. I think you were correct. He was wrong. But that
Yep.
even still, the implication that authority, that we kind of if you try to abolish, for example, an authority structure like the family, it just gets replaced by another one or a bunch of ones.
Yeah.
And, like, we kind of it's part of our structure, if that makes sense, and I think anarchists don't like that because their ideology essentially means moving to communism without the state and without hierarchy. And for that to make any sense, you have to conceive of a subject that is can live without that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, totally. I think Hawes is a right wing Lacanian, and there's many right wing Lacanians. So it's why Jacques Lacan's work is worth reading because, like all great thought, it produces its own spectrum, right? I think that's like a mark or a telltale of the contribution of a truly great thinker, right? We have right wing Nietzscheans, we have left wing Nietzscheans, right wing Lacanians. You know what I'm saying? And I think Haas, after my debate with him, clearly showed his cards as a sort of right wing Lacanian. Now, I'm happy to explain what I see as the shortfalls of that. The shortfalls of that are not merely a poor reading of Lacan. I think that's part of it. But there's also sort of like political ethical shortfalls. You know what I'm saying? In this notion that somehow the father's authority, because Freud famously said that the logic that adheres the libidinal bond, right? The affective, emotional, if you like, bond of any group will structurally be around the love of the father. That's the kind of unconscious mechanism that's at work, that's at play in group adhesions, right? Even revolutionary groups, even spontaneous groups. In fact, spontaneous groups, which he writes about in group psychology, are interesting because they're not actually aware that they're imbuing or projecting that onto the leader. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. So there's an interesting unconscious dimension there. And so one of the things I was trying to say with Haz al-Din is that, you need to actually read more about Freud and Lacan, precisely because I believe that the mega communist movement that he's putting forward has a very strange and strained relationship to paternal authority. In what sense? Well, what I tried to argue, which I think is still true based on how I've seen because I mean, obviously the mega communist thing and Haz's thing is an experimental effort, like Deleuze and Guattari, like a lot of stuff we don't realize we're trying it's a project, right? And that's actually why I debated Haz, because I realized that it's a project. And so if I could actually take another tactic, was not to just be like cancel fascism, reactionary, etc. But what if I came on the inside and said, well, you are a Marxist, I'll give you that, but also you have highly problematic concepts. Let's have a philosophical exchange about these concepts. That was my approach. And then, from that, I think now even I can communicate with Haz and give him feedback, say, look, I think what you're saying and doing is really wrong. And if he listens to me, all the better, as far as I'm concerned. But specifically, Tony, my problem with the structure there is that as a structure of leadership, I found that their whole community is really based on a kind of rigid form of fatherly authority, which avows it. For example, a lot of their followers, when I called Haz as a joke, like as a metaphor even, that he's like a father of the horde, they started to avow it. Like, yeah, he is our father of the horde. And the father of the horde is interesting in psychoanalysis because that's the father who refuses all of the other brothers of the gang enjoyment. In other words, it's the uber father, the uber patriarch. And that's very troubling if they avow that. A lot of groups disavow that, but they're avowing it. And that's a point that I want to tell Haz and his people to modify this. Like, you're not going to go away. You're not purely fascist. You're not Nick Fuentes. In fact, it's interesting that those people fight Nick Fuentes so
Yeah.
much online,
Yeah, yeah.
which I actually respect that about them.
Yeah, they're not
Despite all of
fascist.
the
Say they're reactionary Marxist Leninists. That's all I would say. Like, but they're definitely not fascist. Like, I think you debating them is fine, and just you even challenge them too, which it's like I don't know.
I
Yeah, but,
challenge them philosophically, right? So, okay, you want to. I mean, that's actually one of the interesting things about
well,
Lukács, the
yeah, I want to
Marxist
get
man.
into the thing about patriarchy though, because that
Yeah,
aspect,
yeah.
what I think is interesting, because the way I always understood the implication of authority when it comes to Lacanian psychoanalysis is that the father is a crucial component, but the father is more of a role as opposed to actual biological sex. Like, the role of the father doesn't really have to be played necessarily by like a biological man, but it's still nonetheless like a role that is necessary. So if you take that, I mean, people's have an intrinsic thing to like seek out authorities to kind of guide their subjectivity to an extent. And oh,
Exactly, exactly. I mean, why is Lacan read by feminists, right? If Lacan's message was that the biological father is this sunk or fixed or necessary feature for what does the father do? The father resolves the Oedipal problem. And what is the Oedipal problem? We can define it as the transcendence of dependency, right? So we talked a lot in this conversation about the idea of paternalism. The Oedipus complex, in a liberated concept of it, is one that would affirm that authority is something that has to be met head on, accepted, and then transcended as a dialectic. That's what the Oedipus complex is as a best case of a liberated concept, in the sense that in order for that to happen, we have a late maturation as human subjects, right? We have this kind of extended period that is required for parents to take care of us when we're young children. And there is a dialectic between our needs and therefore then our demands. And the parents negotiate that. And we fall into this kind of triangle whereby we're trying to develop autonomy beyond their, right? Well, one of the things that Freud and Lacan talk about is that there's this repetition, return and return of that structure of dependency that exceeds the parents. Okay. So you can think about this like the identification that people would have to a leader would reproduce the identification that you had in a paternal structure. That's what we talk about when we say, like when Deleuze and Guattari are talking about the Oedipalization of society or of social forms and how that needs to be abolished, right? Well, that's of course true. That is true. That's what Freud means when the leader of a left-wing group takes on a fatherly figure, right? That's true. Okay. But as such, there becomes an ethical, what you might call an ethical spectrum, an ethical political spectrum for how to manage that precise symbolic identification. And one of the things we know from Freud is that Freud and Lacan both also affirm that, basically there are different forms that groups can take in which transcending that becomes the necessary next step. It's not that the subject, and here their claim is based on the kind of dialectic between enjoyment and desire. Their claim is not that the subject finds, this is, I think, a very important point, a great harmony in a patriarchal social structure. No, Freud and Lacan both argue and demonstrate that the subject is in a state of agitation, of anxiety, of anome when they are inducted into a patriarchal structure. If anything, what the dialectic of Oedipus is about is the transcendence of that structure, right? But it's also about the fact that society, civilization, is founded on the Ur-father, the father of the horde. That's Freud's idea in Totem and Taboo in his social writings, This, I don't know how familiar you are with it, but it's
Yeah.
basically this
A lot
idea.
of things was like a myth. Like,
It's a
that's
myth, according to
people write
Lacan.
off the most.
It's a myth, but what's not a myth is that our symbolic, how our identifications function, still adhere to a latent form of that structure of authority. So it kind of lives on symbolically, right? So therefore, Freud has a point. Even though Freud kind of literalized it, Lacan is saying it's actually a dream of Freud. But at the level of social communication and identifications, it's true that we still have this structure. But keep in mind also that Lacan's entire seminar on the names of the father is one that he never gave. And the entirety of Lacan's sort of teaching was a recognition that modernity, like our world, is suffering from some kind of transitionary movement out of the old patriarchy of Freud, right? And that's actually why Lacan is read by feminists, because ultimately Lacan in his late work will come up with this idea that one needs this symbolic operation of what he calls the name of the father, which is basically an operation whereby one is grants themselves permission to invent a new desire. Right? So Lacan would say that the symbolic identification of a father figure, plural, is necessary for initiating you as a subject into a form of independence. Okay. But he says that by no means, and it goes back to the Haas point, does that need to be mediated by a strict fatherly authority or something like that. And I think when you create that mythology where you sort of have literalized this idea that patriarchy is necessary, that's where the mega communist discourse gets what I call LARPing, right? Because that is a form of social order that's not congruent with our current social order. That's actually nostalgia in a reactionary hue. Okay. There's forms of working class or even middle class nostalgia for stability that's not reactionary. That, on the other hand, I do think as reactionary because it's taken a theoretical principle and is rendering it as a static social truth when it's not a static social truth. If Lacan is your theorist, Lacan clearly shows that, and Freud does too, that groups adhered to this strict patriarchal structure. What do? They intensify imaginary aggression. They don't foster independence. That's why Freud is read by feminists and Lacan is too. The point of a patriarchal structure is the affect of aggression and the lack of independence. Now, why is it that Haas's people only see him as the genius? It was almost Nietzschean, almost. Like he's the only one that can debate anybody. That's actually part of the reason why I wanted to debate him, because they kept on saying to me, like, yeah, you're a pussy. You'll never debate him, because he's the uncastrated master. And I'm like, actually, no, he's not. Like, you should humanize him, And so there's a bit of that mega communist, weird, like uber LARPy patriarchal thing that I think is just out of touch
Well,
with reality. Like, it literally is out of touch with reality. It's kind of a fantasy, I would say.
sure, yeah. Well, I think a lot of it is just standard cult-like patterns in the sense that the tendency that occurs with a lot of people who are quote unquote canceled is they sometimes go into like their own little echo chamber.
Yeah.
And when they feel ostracized by like the dominant discourse, in this case, let's say the trademark left, they say, well, you're either part of us or you're part of them. And you kind of have to like orbit around this figure. I mean, I see it with people who aren't even like who are not Haas and who are not even necessarily reactionary who do that too. Well, they'll say, if you're not, you haven't reached my conclusions about the left, it's like you either see it or you don't. And it goes around a kind of person. But I guess to go back to what we were talking about the father, is this brings us to a more practical question, which you deal with in your book, which is the decline of the father and what you call and you draw on Lacan and others, the crisis of initiation, which
Hmm.
I found very fascinating. I would like to hear more about. What is what does the decline of the father mean? Because people hear that and they think that is some kind of like a reactionary dog whistle for the
Right.
decline of patriarchy, and we need to bring back
Right.
patriarchy. So, what did you mean by the decline of the father under capitalism, and from there, crisis of initiation?
Thanks. Yeah, that's a good question. So the decline of it's not the decline of the father, it's the decline of the paternal function, because for Lacan, the question of the subjectivity of our subjectivity revolves around this idea of a deficient function whereby we are capable of transitioning or mediating our desire, right? So the sense of movement is very important here when we think about initiation. So initiation is a concept that I find quite interesting. Now, of course, there have been a lot of reactionaries that use the concept of initiation in like mystical thought, like Jungianism or even like Evola. I don't even really flirt with any of that. And I don't think Jung is a fascist, by the way. But when I use initiation, I try to incorporate it in a sociological and anthropological sense as a subjective process, basically, of inducting or initiating one into a system. So it involves a sort of a question whereby how one becomes an adult, or how one in our era, one of the big points of sociological literature is the kind of death of adulthood, or the kind of crisis of manhood, or the sense in which capitalism keeps us in a state of permanent adolescence, right?
Yeah, but you
So
in
all of that.
True Life talks about that a lot too, like how youth is so valorized under capitalism. Like the new subject is a kind of youthful subject.
Yeah, so there is therefore this grand dialectic of uh sense in which contemporary capitalism has deprived us of stages of self-development. So this concept of selfhood, of becoming your highest self, becoming singular. You may remember in my book on Nietzsche, I really work on the sociology of singularities, right? Which I think is a predominant ideology of our social world today, which is, the kind of highest calling, right, is to self-singularize yourself, to realize your highest brand. And so the crisis of initiation is the crisis of the pure instrumentalization of self-becoming, of selfhood. You could use the phrase of commodification of that. You could talk about this along the lines of the proletarianization of selfhood. How is it that we have singular self-realized subjects who are so deprived in an inner psychic domain, right? Badiou calls it initiation without initiation, right? And he actually argues that the state used to be the kind of guarantor of the initiation process through warfare, actually. So the kind of hidden promise of the bourgeois state was this idea that boys will overcome, will have a clear marker of adulthood through the possibility of their participation in war, right? In recent kind of the neoliberal period, one of the things we've witnessed is the decline of large scale promises of a clear mark of self becoming. In other words, the crisis of initiation is about the way that the market becomes the only site. It's like, what is it when the market is the only site for valuation of your own subjectivity? When even religious communities, right, even participation in grand politics is kind of like the Fight Club theme, kind of like that. Like, what is initiation also? It actually involves a bodily sacrifice, it involves often mutilation. The literature on initiation is worth reading because a lot of folks have shown that it's a constitutive part of self development. And so, what does it mean to have a constitutive part of self development removed from us, right? Or rendered murky, or rendered unclear, or rendered inefficacious? That's what the crisis of initiation is. This is a broad concept. And it's kind of an invitation, Tony, to sort of do more research, I think. Like Michel Clouscard has a wonderful theory of initiation vis-a-vis consumerism, right? So Clouscard has this idea that the consumer subject like has all of these technological objects that unfulfill them, right? So it's like this sort of um, sense in which modern capitalism has everything at our fingertips to become our highest selves, but its procedure leaves us wanting. So there's a great something more that we want. Our initiation isn't working, is the basic idea. So hopefully that gives you a sense, but it's a big concept.
It is a very big concept. Like, honestly, it would probably take a lot longer to flesh out. It's a part
Yeah,
of your book that I'm still currently wrestling with, and it makes me want to check out Rene Girard, who you
yeah,
talk about in it. And I guess the last thing that I would like to talk about, but we're coming up on time, so we'll probably just talk about it in the back room, which is thinking about the family under socialism, envisioning, I mean, how it could be transformed potentially for emancipatory purposes, because you don't take the reactionary position that everything was fine with the previous family, even though working class people have a rightful reason to be nostalgic for it and a rightful reason to, like, be pro family. So, like, what does envisioning family look like? Because one thing that really struck my eye when I was listening to the interview of one of the advocates of a recent book, authors of a recent book called Abolish the Family, was the sheer vagueness of a lot of the solutions, like about, you know, like they don't use the word collectivizing. They say socializing parenthood or socializing the raising of kids, socializing care. But I also feel like what that really means is collectivizing. And if you don't have a concrete idea of like what that is, I feel like the default conclusion would just be every conservative's nightmare, which is essentially delegating the duties of the family to the state. You know, what the so I guess we can talk about that in the back room. But for now, is there any last things you want to say on this episode?
No, I mean, I think this was a great challenging conversation. I mean, the book is obviously doing a lot, but I hope one of my intentions with it is to create conversations. I mean, similar to my Nietzsche book, right? That challenge the left in a way that maintains a good faith sincerity to, because I also feel like one of the things that happens is we have a kind of what I would call a kind of perfunctory concept that spontaneously emerges where we silo ourselves off or we create these kind of cliques, and they're usually formed around theory. And it's striking to me, Tony, that a lot of my heroes from 20th century Marxist thought, if you really read them, one of the things, they're always changing their mind, theoretically, philosophically, what they stand for. Not in massive ways, but often essential ways based on changing circumstances, changing events, learning from failure, things like that. And one of the things that the book is about is that, right? Which is, I've read Anti-Oedipus like 3 or 4 times, right? Like I used to consider myself a Nietzschean. I used to be, you know what I'm saying? And so like, there needs to be a healthy acknowledgement, I think, on the left that we change and we grow, and that we have these also ways of forming solidarity where we avoid shallow critiques of one another. That's a big part of this. Because, yeah. And the other thing is the family is a super overloaded zone of affect and emotion and intensity. I'm not going to say trauma because that word is overused. But that's what makes these conversations hopefully a bit cathartic as well, to work through this. Because it is true that the family is the kind of centrifugal point of political subjectivity, also of ideology. That's one thing we didn't talk about in my section on Pierre Bourdieu. One of the things that French sociologist Bourdieu really helps us with is he shows that, yeah, we have Marxist theory of commodity fetishism as a logic of ideology, but really the family is an incubator of ideology. It's like a different form of fetishism that emerges from family ideology because the family sort of trains you in labor. It trains you in gift giving, right? It trains you in leisure. It trains you in all sorts of class coding
And that's
that are
what the abolitionists critique. They say it deprives us of our natural sociality, our autonomous sociality.
right. But the problem with that is that they have a blind spot about the subjective formation of families and the distinctions that emerge vis-a-vis class, because we didn't even talk about like lumpenized families, right? Like there's gradients and there's
Yeah,
differences, there's different habituses that form, right?
I think that was
Around.
the decline of the family, right? It is essentially the decline of stable two-parent households due to material circumstance. Like that part, I think, was kind of more evident, as I'll make in the title. The question is like, what do you think about that, right? Because like there's like everyone talks about the decline of the family now. People didn't for a while. You're right, actually. Like in many ways, someone like Trump brings this to the surface a lot, like in very superficial ways. And Bernie Sanders talked about it a lot in his campaign. But now people recognize it as a problem, but it's like, how do we think of it? That's where the big disagreements are. So yeah,
Yeah,
that's
totally. Oh, completely. Yeah, because there's a sort of problem of equality, right? That the family introduces, the common parlance. Yeah, like Bourdieu says that the family creates an incubation point for making it taboo. They place a taboo on making explicit forms of family patronage and gift giving, which are never revealed. So he has this very interesting thing that he works a lot with Flaubert, the famous European writer, who talks a lot about how bourgeois society and the bourgeois family is an incubation point for deceit. It trains you in deceit, trains you to
Mhm.
wear masks. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Um, and I find that interesting. And that's not to say that the working class family is not trained in lying or something. It's a different form, though. It's a different form, and there's a different innocence involved there. So we always have to have that like experiential and maybe even empirical focus, and that's a big challenge for philosophers to get into the nitty-gritty of empiricism. That's a big challenge in my book, even a challenge for myself, because this book was written also to continue. I write books to open up research, not close down.
Hmm. Yeah, I can see that.
You know what I'm saying? Like Nietzsche, like I'm still doing all kinds of stuff on Nietzsche and the left. Like I didn't talk about anarchist Nietzscheans, but I want to now. I want to do like a whole book series on that. Things like that. And the same with family. Maybe that's something that people could learn from this conversation as a strategy for writing a book themselves. That a book is an invitation to a conversation, but also to further research.
Right. Yeah, I think that's what philosophy is. I mean, it's more posing the questions that we take for granted. It's
Yeah,
questioning
exactly.
dogmas we take for granted, and from there we can, look
But that's
towards.
not how people think of books. People think of books, I would say, Tony, as like a finished thing that's like, oh,
Sure.
it's, you know,
Yeah, I mean
like,
philosophy, because you're a philosopher, and I think that's why you're
yeah, yeah.
deserving of the title, because that is what good philosophy is, and it asks necessary questions. So yeah, we'll chat more about that in the back room. For now, definitely check out Tut's work if you haven't already. It's linked in the description. You've probably been familiar if you're a regular listener of the pod, and if you're a regular listener of the pod and you're not a patron,
You should be.
if you haven't been listening to the backroom episodes, you should definitely become one, because there's a lot of great material in there, fascinating conversations I've had. So yeah, but if you're, too broke, I understand. You can always leave a 5-star rating. It helps. And see you in the back room.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimist, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.